Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. I was in a conversation with someone today and they asked me to explain sexual attraction. And I thought, wow, how would I do that? Now, to somebody that's had sex, it's easy. They already know what it feels like and you just kind of put words on it. But if you're trying to describe this to somebody that has never had sex, how would you go about explaining it? See, this is a different dimension for me. And I would think about, okay, puberty. What happens to the body at, during these phases of life when you're developing and growing? And you tend to notice those things about yourself. Your breasts develop, your genitals develop. This thing happens, and the voice changes, and for guys, they start getting the mustache or maybe the, growth of a beard or something like that, sideburns, all of those things tend to change, and you tend to begin to notice stuff. It's as if when you first open your eyes and you start to see colors and you use your ears and you hear sounds and things that you never heard before, the body starts to morph into something more. And vis-a-vis, as the body is changing, these are hormones. These chemicals are also flooding your brain. And being that the brain is basically a bunch of electrical, chemical signals and things that are flying back and forth, I'm just using some way to describe it, you tend to notice somebody and there's some sort of attraction. You don't necessarily know why, but you sense something that draws you to that person. And whether at that moment you feel something through your genitals or whatever it is that feels like it might want to express itself at that moment, maybe that's what sexual attraction is. And describing it to somebody that has never had it before, that's what comes to mind. Now, if you've already had sex, you already know what that feels like. And for those that have had good sex, you tend to want to have a repeat. You see somebody or somebody that you're attracted to, and you want to experience that with them. Now, thinking about this brings to mind something. There was a researcher, his name was John Money, and he wrote a book called Love Maps. It was written many years ago, and for those of you that like to do a little bit of research, look that book up. You probably can find it online somewhere and order it, most likely in some paperback. Maybe it's in hardback form, but I know it happens to exist in a paperback. And John Money was a researcher, and what he did is, in writing the book about Love Maps, he talks about how we as human beings become wired to be attracted to other people, how that goes about. And I found it fascinating. Again, if you're a researcher or interested in research, grab that book and fill your mind with some really interesting information. But I'm going to borrow from that in how I describe who we become attracted to. And a lot of this is imprinted upon us when we are very young. Hence, like I said, when you're developing, going through your puberty stages, and you start feeling things, emotions run through your mind. Your body feels certain sensations when you touch yourself in different places. And, we experience this, and it's very unique. So, and when we're touching our genitals, I think we sense that there's some sort of sexual component to it. Not always. Obviously, we have those parts of our body for other reasons. It's not just for one simple purpose. But when there's some pleasure associated with it, I think we tend to label that as sexual pleasure, and wanting to share that experience with another person, someone that, for reasons like a person like John Money can explain why we're attracted to that other person, but wanting to experience that with them, I would describe that as some sort of sexual chemistry. Now, to those who have had sex already, who you're attracted to, whether it's a certain height, certain body type, certain hair color, eye color, those kinds of physical features which really play a big part in attraction for people. And I'm going to put a word on this. I'm going to call it desire. When you have that for an individual and you want to express that with that person, that which I will now describe also as that sexual tension, that chemistry, and having a good experience with that makes you want to do that again. And you learn through trial and error what works. I mean, maybe some people like to do a bit of research, whether it's books. Nowadays, it can be videos, it can be online. However, you get that knowledge to help you understand what works and why it works for you. It sort of becomes your own personal journey because it is something that feels good, and it seems like it is something that will be a part of your life for a long, long time. And even for people that have never really had sexual chemistry, and let's take it way back to, before they really understood sex and a lot of what goes on with it, there's probably been conversation about it, and you've just been curious. So there is a curiosity that also unfolds, and which sort of drives the wanting to figure this thing out. And, the newness of something like this, of this kind of discovery. Imagine back to when you were young and this was something very, very new. I can remember how even the discussion of something like this could be potentially very embarrassing. So you were really careful, maybe really cagey about who you would even discuss something like this with. Some people find out through experience that, if you're asking an adult, some adults aren't very comfortable talking about sex, and they pretty much try to, shut kids down because, granted, they don't have answers when they're trying to shut somebody down. They try to put the genie back in the bottle, but, once you've had a taste of the fruit, as it were, then it's kind of hard to go backwards on that, even when people have the experience of somebody telling them, no, you can't do that. Hormones tend to make people chase what they feel, and we've seen how that goes a lot of times. Have you ever given kids a lot of sugar and then tell them to settle down? It doesn't work, does it? Sexual chemistry also tends to make people think of this mating ritual, and they want to share that experience with another person, that the object of their desire, and hope for pleasure, and they want to repeat it over and over again. It makes people want to sneak off and do things that they wouldn't ordinarily want to be necessarily caught doing, whether it's in the car or outside somewhere, wherever people have their sex at. It could be pretty much anywhere. We're talking human beings here. People go to great lengths to have their sexual experiences, and that's part of that desire thing happening. That's the sexual attraction. That's the chemistry that tends to build and build and build until there's till there's a release. I'm looking at the time frame here. I need to do a commercial, and I will be right back. Stay tuned.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
All right, hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm talking about sexual attraction. And so the question would be, and if you're new to all of this, you've a young person who've never had the sexual attraction thing, you've just understanding something and you happen to stumble across this podcast, well, is sexual attraction and friendship different? Yes, it is definitely a different feeling. Now, you may at some point in time have sexual feelings toward a friend, but it is definitely a different feeling because you can be friends with lots of different people, but when it comes to feeling that sexual attraction and sexual tension, it tend to be much more narrowly focused. And that's a very simplified explanation for it, but it's just so that you understand that sexual attraction and friendship are different. Now, moving on, what happens, so this is a different question. So what happens to sexual attraction if it's not reciprocated? Now, I'm going to say it really depends on the individual. And this happens in relationships all the time. I've known of long-term relationships where one of the questions that comes up, we talk about mismatched desire. You may have one partner that has desire and another person that doesn't. They've been around each other for a while, and sex counselors deal with things like that, and there could be a lot of reasons for that, some of which could be something going on in the relationship that one person just doesn't feel like they want to be that connected. They don't want to be vulnerable sexually to their partner, so that affects the sexual desire, that affects the sexual attraction. Now, for the person who is not getting the need met, again, in a long-term relationship, there's obviously going to be challenges to that. They have things to discuss. Now, if it's not a committed relationship, then I think what tends to happen in those cases is that the person is just going to move on. I mean, there will probably be some discussion about, okay, what's happening? How come we're not physically intimate? This is something I want. This is something I need. One of the reasons why I got into the relationship is because that's a part of me that needs to be expressed. And if it's not working out, then people generally tend to call it and say, we're done here. I'm moving on, and you can go find somebody who's more to your interest, more to your liking. Now, another component to the sexual attraction happens to be when it's cross-cultural. Now, if you've grown to experience people, say, of your same type, people who look like you, people who tend to do some of the same things that you do, and, all fairly common, fairly similar things. And you might find somebody who's interesting in that group, want to become involved with them. And then there is something that seems a little more exotic when you find somebody who is outside of your village, so to speak, somebody from the other side of the tracks. And maybe they do some of the same kinds of things that you do, but maybe they're a little more exciting to watch or to be in their space. Maybe they speak a little different, and maybe they look a lot different than you do. See, that creates some interest. There's obviously some mystery surrounding that, and there could be a hankering to want to be closer to that person, to find out about them And all of this could weave in and out with those, those spikes of those hormone rages that happen. And I'm talking about young people here. When they feel something, they don't necessarily know how to put words to it, but they're feeling something, and they like holding hands or kissing somebody or having being touched in a way that's unique to more of a romantic kind of thing as opposed to friends. Friends do the handshake, they might do the quick hug and concern, caress to make sure everything is all right. But then when you have that's on a different level, that the handshake or that the hand holding is a signifying a unity, so to speak. I mean, I'm sort of thinking out loud here. Then there's a different kind of connection. That's deeper than just a friendship. There's a building romance there, and underneath that could be sexual tension and looking for a way to express that safely. We teach that being sexual inside of a relationship that has some commitment to it offers more safety and security in terms of the vulnerability than something that doesn't offer that type of protection in terms of safety and commitment. Commitment, see, there's that word. And that will happen. That word will show up a lot when we start talking about sex, because the safety around being involved with someone and expressing yourself, being vulnerable, and doing it inside of a commitment as opposed to not, because of what happens emotionally when you make yourself vulnerable, when you strip away all of the protections that you have and then allow somebody to see your core, your inner child. You want them close because you don't want them to go away. They take everything that you have to offer, and if they leave with it, then you feel empty, you feel vulnerable, exposed, used. Now, I'm sure as adults, we tend to experience those kinds of things also, but having lived life, tend to do a better job of being able to handle those things when an emotional wound happens. We know that we can go to counselors. Maybe you have a favorite book that you read that talks about, the self-help kind of thing. So we have a few more tools in our toolbox, but when you're young, you don't necessarily have that information in life yet. You're kind of experiencing these things. Something happens, and when they happen, let's say you have an emotional breakdown, you have a letdown, so you get disappointed. If you're a parent, you're probably going to notice that your child is, there's something different about them. Maybe they're crying or they're wanting to be off on their own, and they're isolating or something like that. You might want to go and talk to them, and then you begin this process of teaching them about love and relationships and romance and heartbreak, and it's a cycle, and important in that is learning how to heal from it and move forward. Because the one thing we tend to remember about love and being in relationships is that when it's not going well, it certainly hurts a lot, makes you feel terrible. But when it goes well, it certainly makes you want to be in it and keep doing it. And I think the one thing that I remember about love and relationships, especially when I was a lot younger, was, the bigger the potential for embarrassment around something like this made me more and more curious as to what it was about. Meaning, why did people want to be in a relationship? Why did they want to expose themselves to all that vulnerability? What was it about? Was it about having sex? Was it about having a special friend? Was it about being able to rely on somebody day in and day out? What was it? I found that fascinating. What I remember experiencing as a young man was the emotional volatility of the girls in my age range. And that part was really scary, because having somebody go through their emotional range, and I mean this, respectfully. Girls who were in that 15, 16, 17, early teens or late teens, rather, into their early 20s, as you're kind of getting into, the high school dating and then into the early college thing, it just seemed to ricochet back and forth, and understanding what was happening and trying not to get caught up in, the emotional roller coaster there was really rough, which made me pull back to just wanting to be in the friend zone, because I felt like at least when I was there, I was out of the line of fire and couldn't get in trouble with anyone. Because at that point in time in life, it seemed like when a girl was mad at you, it was going to become a public spectacle. And I certainly didn't want any of that. I'm going to take a break right here, and I'll be right back after that.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm talking about sexual attraction. And, as I've been talking, I realize that I've sort of geared a lot of this conversation towards young people who have never experienced a lot in terms of relationships and talking about sexual attraction, and how would I describe it to them? Because if you are older and you've already had relationships, then it's really just putting words on something that you already understand. But if you've never been through that, think back. How would you describe it to them? And one of the things that I vividly remember is when I left off, I talked about the embarrassment and not wanting to have the drama or be part of a public spectacle of something that could potentially blow my, that image of myself, which I thought of as somebody who was really good-natured, easy to get along with, and I was never the kind of guy who wanted to upset anyone. And having a young lady who was upset with me about something was certainly not an experience I wanted to have. Now, all that on top of one of the things that I haven't even mentioned yet when it relates to sex, but it's about kids and experimenting, with sexual intercourse, being unprotected. The various sexually transmitted diseases that come out that people are certainly vulnerable to. And when you're young and you're experiencing or experimenting with sex, quite often, I talked about how transitory some of these relationships can be, with the emotional volatility. Sex also becomes one of those things that's very, very powerful. Kids are always curious about it. And young ladies learn, interestingly enough, they learn how very powerful their sexuality is. Now, guys learn the same thing. They can be very masculine. The guys on the football team, the guys on the basketball team, baseball team. These are the guys that tend to attract all the girls, and they understand something about what attracts a young lady, and they go for it. Their hormones are raging too, and you get teenagers, their hormones are raging. Well, you just hope that you've coach them enough so that they learn what safe sex is about, so they're not out putting themselves at risk for things that we definitely don't want them to put themselves at risk doing. So for this last little bit, I want to reach back and talk not just about young people, but about older people when we talk about sexual attraction and how that plays out. Now, one of the things that happens as we're older and we've lived our lives, I think we're also looking to reinvent ourselves. And sexuality is certainly one of those things that we like to reinvent. We like to try something fresh and something new, something interesting to us, something that motivates us to try something different, a different person, break out of the mold of what you've always seen as being an attractive person, but literally just going different, whether it's a different age, whether it's a different culture, different ethnicity. What's going to be exciting to you now? And, what are you open to? That's another thing. That's what makes sex interesting. What are you open to? A lot of sexual experiences that people have had are pretty routine. Maybe now's an opportunity to experience being with a lover who, if you like to do workshops together, there are workshops on how to be better lovers. Take a look on the internet and look for something like that. It might be maybe a weekend retreat, and you can practice intimacy with your lover. One other thing I'll mention, and this has to do with sexual attraction, and it is vulnerability. And let me state that vulnerability is not a weakness. In fact, it is part of the attraction. And the reason vulnerability is part of the attraction, because you single out that person you are interested in. So you don't give that vulnerability to everyone. It is very special. You tailor that to the individual. And that's how they know that they are special. See, there again, that's why vulnerability is important. Now, it's not something we're always primed to do because we are constantly talking about our strengths. And for that reason, we tend to want to display those strengths. But it's really in the being gentle, to the being soft, to being vulnerable, to being available. That is so much a part of the attraction. And if you haven't experienced that part of it yet, think about how can you show your vulnerability so that you can be attractive to the person that you're interested in, and find out ways in which they can reciprocate their vulnerability for you, whether you do it in words, whether you can share a gift, take that weekend retreat that I've talked about, or reading a book to each other, sharing that kind of time, that kind of intimacy, that builds in the attraction. And something else, and if you haven't thought of this is a way to kind of build sexual attraction with someone. You talk about these things, long before you ever have any physical intimacy. But when you begin a relationship with someone, everybody starts out with a blank slate, and we're trying to figure out how we fit in with each other. And if you use these things as talking points, at least as a way to start a conversation, like I said, understand what you're vulnerable to and the things that you like about it. Talk about the kinds of books in, discussing relationships. Those kinds of things are very, very interesting, and it helps build that sexual attraction, builds that you are unique, you are different, you are more exotic. And we tend to go for that. I mean, if you've had relationships, then I think what you're looking for is something that's a little different than what didn't work last time, right? You're not going to do a repeat of that. You want somebody who is original, who's creative, who sparks your interest and your desire, because you want to be on the same page with that. Now take your vulnerability and your sexual attraction and make a difference in your life. I'm John Johnson.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.